Police officer finds little girl shaking with fever in the forest. When he checks her pants, he panics. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The summer storm hit Pinewood County with the fury of an angry giant. Rain hammered against Officer Matthew Clark's patrol car windshield as he navigated the winding forest road, his headlights cutting through sheets of water that seemed to dance in the darkness. Matthew had been a police officer for 12 years, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the anniversary approaching. 3 years since his younger sister Lisa had passed away from complications related to her difficult childhood. The guilt still gnawed at him. He should have protected her better when they were kids. He should have seen the signs earlier. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the road ahead for just a moment. That's when he saw her. A small figure lay motionless on the wet asphalt, barely visible through the rain. Matthew's heart stopped. He slammed on the brakes, his patrol car skidding slightly on the slick pavement. "Please God, let me not be too late," he whispered, jumping out into the pelting rain. The little girl couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. Her clothes were soaked through, not just from tonight's storm, but they looked like they hadn't been changed in days. Her small body shivered uncontrollably, and when Matthew knelt beside her, he could feel the heat radiating from her fevered skin. "Hey there, sweetheart," Matthew said softly, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "I'm Officer Matthew. I'm here to help you." The girl's eyes fluttered open, deep brown eyes that held far too much fear for someone so young. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper. Don't take me back. Please." Something twisted in Matthew's chest. Those words, that look of pure terror. It transported him back 25 years to when Lisa used to hide in their bedroom closet, whispering similar pleas. The memory hit him like a physical blow. "Nobody's going to hurt you," Matthew promised, gently lifting the girl into his arms. She was so light, too light for a child her age. "What's your name, honey?" "Emma," she managed to say, her small hand clutching his uniform with surprising strength. "My name is Emma." Matthew carried her to his patrol car, his mind racing. No reports of missing children had come through dispatch. How had this little girl ended up alone on a deserted forest road in the middle of nowhere during a violent storm? As he placed Emma in the back seat and wrapped her in his emergency blanket, she looked up at him with those haunting eyes. "You won't leave me, will you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not going anywhere," Matthew replied, though he knew that promise might be harder to keep than he realized. He radioed for an ambulance, but the storm was interfering with communication. The nearest hospital was 20 minutes away, and Emma's fever was burning dangerously high. Her breathing was shallow, and she kept mumbling incoherent words about staying hidden and not being found. Matthew made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He started the engine and headed straight for Pinewood General Hospital, driving through the storm with the most precious cargo he'd ever carried. "Stay with me, Emma," he said, glancing in the rearview mirror as her eyes began to close again. "We're almost there. You're safe now." But even as he said those words, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that Emma's story was just beginning, and that nothing about this night would be simple. As they pulled into the hospital emergency entrance, Emma's hand reached forward and touched his shoulder. "Thank you for finding me," she whispered. Matthew turned around and saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. Not just fear, but a deep sadness that no child should ever have to carry. The emergency room at Pinewood General Hospital buzzed with late-night activity, but Dr. Rachel Morgan immediately focused on the small patient Officer Clark carried through the doors. "We need a pediatric room stat," Rachel called out, her experienced eyes quickly assessing Emma's condition. At 31, Rachel had seen countless emergency cases, but something about this little girl tugged at her heart. "What do we have?" Rachel asked as they rushed Emma to examination room 3. "Found her on Forest Road during the storm," Matthew explained, still dripping wet from the rain. "She's burning up with fever, seems malnourished, and—" He paused, watching Emma's frightened eyes dart around the room. "She's terrified of something." Rachel began her examination gently. Emma's temperature read 103 degrees, and she showed clear signs of not having eaten properly in days. But what concerned Rachel most were the old, faded marks on Emma's arms. Not fresh injuries, but signs that she hadn't been properly cared for. "Sweetie, can you tell me how long you've been feeling sick?" Rachel asked softly. Emma looked past the doctor to Matthew, who stood in the corner. Only when he nodded encouragingly did she whisper, "A few days, maybe more. Time feels funny." That's when Olivia Brooks arrived. As Pinewood County's lead child welfare specialist, Olivia had been called in whenever children were found in unusual circumstances. At 29, she'd learned to read between the lines of what children couldn't say. "Hi, Emma," Olivia said with a warm smile, pulling up a chair beside the hospital bed. "I'm Olivia. I help kids who might need someone to talk to." Emma immediately retreated under her blanket, peeking out only to look at Matthew. "Is he staying?" she asked, pointing at the officer. Matthew felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same protective instinct he'd felt with his sister Lisa. "I'm not going anywhere," he assured her. As Rachel worked to bring down Emma's fever and Olivia tried to gather basic information, Captain Harris appeared in the doorway. Matthew's supervisor looked stern and tired. "Clark, I need to speak with you." Outside. In the hospital corridor, Captain Harris crossed his arms. "I know that look, Matthew. You're getting personally involved. Sir, she's just a scared little girl who needs professional help, not a police officer playing father figure," Harris interrupted. "We have protocols for a reason. Child Services will handle this from here." Matthew glanced back through the window at Emma, who was watching anxiously for his return. "She won't talk to anyone else, Captain. Something happened to her, and she trusts me. That's exactly why you need to step back. Maintain professional distance, Clark. That's an order." But when Matthew returned to the room, Emma immediately reached for his hand. "You came back," she said with relief that broke his heart. "I promised I would," Matthew replied, knowing he was about to face the hardest decision of his career. Rachel pulled Matthew aside. "She's asking for you specifically. In 15 years of pediatric medicine, I've rarely seen a child bond this quickly with someone. That's significant." Emma called out softly, "Officer Matthew, will you stay until I fall asleep? I have bad dreams when I'm alone." Matthew looked at Captain Harris, then back at Emma's hopeful face. "Of course I will, sweetheart." But as Emma finally drifted off to sleep, she whispered something that made everyone in the room freeze. "He told me I could never tell anyone where I really came from." Chapter 2. The emergency room at Pinewood General Hospital buzzed with late-night activity, but Dr. and Rachel Morgan immediately focused on the small patient officer Clark carried through the doors. "We need a pediatric room stat," Rachel called out, her experienced eyes quickly assessing Emma's condition. At 31, Rachel had seen countless emergency cases, but something about this little girl tugged at her heart. "What do we have?" Rachel asked as they rushed Emma to examination room 3. "Found her on Forest Road during the storm," Matthew explained, still dripping wet from the rain. "She's burning up with fever, seems malnourished, and—" He paused, watching Emma's frightened eyes dart around the room. "She's terrified of something." Rachel began her examination gently. Emma's temperature read 103 degrees, and she showed clear signs of not having eaten properly in days. But what concerned Rachel most were the old faded marks on Emma's arms. Not fresh injuries, but signs that she hadn't been properly cared for. "Sweetie, can you tell me how long you've been feeling sick?" Rachel asked softly. Emma looked past the doctor to Matthew, who stood in the corner. Only when he nodded encouragingly did she whisper, "A few days, maybe more. Time feels funny." That's when Olivia Brooks arrived. As Pinewood County's lead child welfare specialist, Olivia had been called in whenever children were found in unusual circumstances. At 29, she'd learned to read between the lines of what children couldn't say. "Hi, Emma," Olivia said with a warm smile, pulling up a chair beside the hospital bed. "I'm Olivia. I help kids who might need someone to talk to." Emma immediately retreated under her blanket, peeking out only to look at Matthew. "Is he staying?" she asked, pointing at the officer. Matthew felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same protective instinct he'd felt with his sister Lisa. "I'm not going anywhere," he assured her. As Rachel worked to bring down Emma's fever and Olivia tried to gather basic information, Captain Harris appeared in the doorway. Matthew's supervisor looked stern and tired. "Clark, I need to speak with you." Outside, in the hospital corridor, Captain Harris crossed his arms. "I know that look, Matthew. You're getting personally involved." "Sir, she's just a scared little girl who needs professional help, not a police officer playing father figure," Harris interrupted. "We have protocols for a reason. Child Services will handle this from here." Matthew glanced back through the window at Emma, who was watching anxiously for his return. "She won't talk to anyone else, Captain. Something happened to her and she trusts me." "That's exactly why you need to step back. Maintain professional distance, Clark. That's an order." But when Matthew returned to the room, Emma immediately reached for his hand. "You came back," she said with relief that broke his heart. "I promised I would," Matthew replied, knowing he was about to face the hardest decision of his career. Rachel pulled Matthew aside. "She's asking for you specifically. In 15 years of pediatric medicine, I've rarely seen a child bond this quickly with someone. That's significant." Emma called out softly, "Officer Matthew, will you stay until I fall asleep? I have bad dreams when I'm alone." Matthew looked at Captain Harris, then back at Emma's hopeful face. "Of course I will, sweetheart." But as Emma finally drifted off to sleep, she whispered something that made everyone in the room freeze. "He told me I could never tell anyone where I really came from." Chapter 3. Morning sunlight streamed through the hospital room windows as Emma slowly woke up. Her fever had broken during the night, but the confusion in her eyes remained. Matthew had kept his promise, spending the entire night in an uncomfortable chair beside her bed. When Emma saw him there, she smiled for the first time. A genuine, radiant smile that transformed her entire face. "You really stayed," she said with wonder. "I told you I would," Matthew replied, stretching his stiff muscles. "How are you feeling today?" "Better, but..." Emma's smile faded. "I keep thinking about yesterday, about running away, but I can't remember exactly where I ran from." Dr. Rachel entered with Olivia, both looking refreshed after a few hours of sleep. "Good morning, Emma. You look much better today." Olivia sat down with a notepad. "Emma, honey, we need to find out where you live so we can contact your family. Can you help us with that?" Emma's face scrunched up in concentration. "I lived with Uncle Victor, but it wasn't really a house. It was more like a cabin, deep in the woods where nobody could find us." "Find you?" Matthew asked gently. "Were you hiding from someone?" "Uncle Victor said we had to stay hidden. He said there were bad people looking for me, and if they found me, terrible things would happen." Emma's voice became smaller. "But I got so scared and lonely. I just wanted to see other kids, maybe go to school like in the books he read to me." Olivia exchanged a glance with Matthew. "Emma, how long have you lived with Uncle Victor?" "Forever, I think, since I was really little." Emma paused, then added something that made everyone's heart skip a beat. "But sometimes I have dreams about a different place, a big house with loud voices and people who are always angry." Matthew leaned forward. "Do you remember anything else about this big house?" Emma closed her eyes, concentrating. "There was a lady with pretty jewelry who cried a lot, and a man who slammed doors. They would yell at each other, and I would hide in my room." She opened her eyes suddenly. "But Uncle Victor saved me from all that noise." Rachel noticed something crucial. "Emma, do you remember your last name?" The little girl shook her head slowly. "Uncle Victor always said names weren't important. He called me his little bird because I was supposed to stay in our nest where it was safe." Olivia began typing on her laptop. "I'm checking missing children reports for the past several years. If someone is looking for you, Emma, we'll find them." But after an hour of searching, Olivia looked up with confusion. "This is strange. There are no missing child reports matching Emma's description anywhere in the state database." Matthew felt a chill run down his spine. "What does that mean?" "It means either no one reported Emma missing or..." Olivia hesitated, glancing at the little girl who was now drawing pictures with crayons Rachel had brought her. "Or what?" Matthew pressed. "Or officially Emma doesn't exist." Emma looked up from her drawing, a picture of a small cabin surrounded by tall trees, with two stick figures holding hands. Uncle Victor always said I was his secret treasure that nobody else could know about. She held up another drawing that made everyone in the room go silent. It showed a large house in the background, dark and imposing with storm clouds overhead. "This is the scary place," Emma said matter-of-factly. "The place I can never, ever go back to." But who was Uncle Victor really? And what was he protecting Emma from that was so terrible she couldn't officially exist? The next morning, Captain Harris stood firmly in the hospital corridor, his expression leaving no room for argument. "Clark, you're off this case effective immediately," he said, holding up an official transfer order. "Detective Morrison will handle the investigation from here." Matthew felt his world tilt. "Captain, with all due respect, Emma won't talk to anyone else. She's already been through enough trauma without—" "Exactly my point. You're too emotionally involved." Harris softened his tone slightly. "Matthew, I've watched you these past 3 years since Lisa passed. You're trying to save every child you meet, and that's not healthy." The words stung because they held truth. Matthew knew he saw his sister in every vulnerable child, but Emma was different. "She trusts me, sir. That has to count for something. Trust doesn't override protocol. Detective Morrison has 15 years of experience with sensitive cases involving children." As if on cue, Detective Morrison approached, a stern woman in her 40s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor. "Officer Clark, I'll need your complete report and any personal observations about the child." Inside Emma's room, the little girl was having lunch with Dr. Rachel when she noticed Matthew hadn't come to visit. "Where's Officer Matthew?" she asked, her voice small and worried. "He's working on your case," Rachel said carefully. "Detective Morrison is here to talk with you." Emma immediately pushed her food away and pulled the blanket over her head. "I don't want to talk to her. I want Matthew." Detective Morrison tried for 20 minutes to engage Emma in conversation, but the child remained hidden under her blanket, occasionally peeking out to ask, "Is Matthew coming back?" Meanwhile, Matthew sat in his patrol car in the hospital parking lot, officially banned from entering Emma's room. His radio crackled with routine calls, but all he could think about was Emma's frightened eyes and her question, "You won't leave me, will you?" Dr. Rachel found him there during her lunch break. "She hasn't eaten since morning," she reported. "She keeps asking for you, and frankly, I'm concerned about her emotional state." "Captain's orders," Matthew said bitterly. "Professional distance." "Sometimes protocols don't account for human connection," Rachel said quietly. "In my medical opinion, separating you from Emma right now could harm her recovery." That afternoon, Olivia brought news that complicated everything. "I've been digging deeper into missing children reports. I expanded the search to surrounding states and found something interesting." She showed Matthew a report from 3 years ago. A child matching Emma's general description was reportedly seen with an unidentified man at a bus station in Kentucky, but the report was never followed up on. Kentucky? That's hundreds of miles away. Exactly. If Emma really has been living with this Uncle Victor in isolation, she could have been moved multiple times without anyone knowing. Back in her hospital room, Emma finally spoke to Detective Morrison, but only to ask one heartbreaking question. "Did I do something wrong? Is that why Matthew doesn't want to see me anymore?" Morrison's professional exterior cracked slightly. "No, honey. You didn't do anything wrong. The grown-ups are just trying to figure out the best way to help you." Emma nodded solemnly, then said something that would change everything. "Uncle Victor told me that if anyone ever found me, they would ask lots of questions. He said if that happened, I should tell them about the nightmares." "What nightmares, Emma?" "The ones about the big house where people screamed at night and nobody ever smiled." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "He said those people might try to take me back there, and I should never, ever let them." Was Uncle Victor protecting Emma from a dangerous past, or was he the danger himself? And why was Emma so terrified of returning to her mysterious former life? 3 days had passed since Matthew had been removed from Emma's case, and the little girl's condition was becoming a serious concern for everyone at Pinewood General Hospital. Dr. Rachel knocked softly on Emma's door before entering. "Good morning, sweetheart. How are you feeling today?" Emma sat by the window, staring out at the parking lot where she hoped to see Matthew's patrol car. She'd barely touched her breakfast. "Is he coming today?" she asked without turning around. "Emma, we've talked about this. Officer Matthew is working on other important cases, but Detective Morrison and I are here to help you." For the first time in days, Emma turned around, and Rachel was startled by the sadness in her young eyes. "He promised he wouldn't leave me. Everyone always leaves." The pain in those words hit Rachel deeply. She sat down beside Emma. "Tell me about Uncle Victor, honey. Did he ever leave you?" Emma's expression softened slightly. "Uncle Victor never left me alone for very long. Sometimes he would go to town for food and supplies, but he always came back before dark." She paused, remembering. "He said the world outside our cabin was dangerous, full of people who didn't understand about keeping secrets." "What kind of secrets?" "About who I really am. Uncle Victor said I had to stay hidden because—" Emma struggled to find the words. "Because the people from my before life were looking for me, and they weren't nice people." Detective Morrison entered the room with Olivia, both carrying files and looking concerned. "Emma, we need to ask you some important questions about Uncle Victor. Can you tell us what he looked like?" Emma nodded. "He was tall and had gray hair and kind eyes. He always smelled like wood and pine trees because he worked outside a lot. He built our cabin all by himself." Her face brightened. "And he told the best stories. Stories about brave little girls who overcame scary things." "Did Uncle Victor ever tell you his last name?" Morrison asked. "Uncle Victor said last names were just labels that didn't matter. What mattered was that he loved me and kept me safe." Emma's voice grew quieter, but sometimes at night I heard him crying in his room. When I asked him why, he said he was sad because he missed someone very much. Olivia leaned forward gently. "Emma, this is very important. Do you remember anything about your life before Uncle Victor? Anything at all about your parents or your real family?" Emma closed her eyes tightly, concentrating. "I remember being scared a lot. There was a big house with shiny floors and pretty pictures on the walls, but the people in the house—" She shuddered. "They were always angry. The lady would cry and throw things, and the man would slam doors so hard the whole house would shake." "Do you remember their names?" Morrison asked. "The lady was called Margaret, and the man—" Emma's face scrunched up in concentration. "He had a name that sounded important, like a king's name." Rachel noticed Emma was becoming distressed. "It's okay, honey. You don't have to remember everything at once." But Emma continued, as if a dam had burst. "Uncle Victor found me hiding in the garden one day. I was crying because the loud voices scared me. He said he worked for the angry people, but he couldn't stand to see a little girl so frightened." Tears began rolling down her cheeks. "He said he would take me somewhere quiet and peaceful, where no one would yell ever again." "How old were you when that happened?" Olivia asked softly. "I think I was 4, maybe 5. I'm 7 now, I think. Uncle Victor always made me a birthday cake with candles, but we never told anyone else about my birthdays." Detective Morrison exchanged a meaningful look with Olivia. If Emma was telling the truth, she'd been living with Uncle Victor for approximately 3 years, and no one had reported her missing. Emma suddenly looked directly at Detective Morrison. "Uncle Victor said if anything ever happened to him, if he couldn't protect me anymore, I should find a police officer with kind eyes and tell them everything." She wiped her tears. "Officer Matthew has kind eyes. That's why I trust him." But just as Emma finished speaking, a tall man with gray hair appeared in the hospital corridor, looking frantically in every direction. Uncle Victor had found her. The man in the hospital corridor moved with urgency, stopping at the nurse's station and speaking in hushed, desperate tones. Emma couldn't see him from her room, but something made her look toward the door with sudden anxiety. "Someone's here," she whispered, shrinking back into her hospital bed. "I can feel it." Dr. Rachel immediately moved to the window that overlooked the hallway. "Emma, there's a man here asking about you. He says he's your guardian." Emma's eyes went wide. "Uncle Victor, he found me." But instead of relief, her expression showed confusion and fear. "He's going to be so worried. He told me never to leave the cabin without him. Detective Morrison stepped into the hallway to observe the man. He matched Emma's description perfectly. Tall, gray-haired, wearing work clothes that smelled of pine and outdoors. But what struck Morrison most was his obvious distress. "Please, I need to see her," the man was saying to the nurses. "Her name is Emma, and she's been missing for 3 days. I've been searching everywhere." He produced what appeared to be legal guardianship papers. "I'm Victor Hendricks, her legal guardian." When Detective Morrison approached him, Victor's relief was palpable. "Thank God you found her. Is she hurt? Is she okay?" "She's physically fine, Mr. Hendricks, but we need to ask you some questions about how a 7-year-old girl ended up alone on a forest road during a storm." Victor's face crumpled with guilt. "It was an accident. Emma has been having episodes lately, moments where she gets confused and frightened about things that happened before she came to live with me." He showed Morrison a medical report. "She has PTSD from her early childhood experiences. Sometimes she runs away when she's scared." Inside the room, Emma heard Victor's voice and began crying, not from fear but from conflicted emotions. "He sounds so sad," she told Dr. Rachel. "I didn't mean to make him worry." Victor continued explaining to Detective Morrison. "Emma's parents died in a car accident 3 years ago. The trauma was so severe that she blocked out most of her memories. I'm her uncle, her father's brother, and I've been caring for her since then." He showed more documents, death certificates, custody papers, even medical records detailing Emma's supposed trauma therapy. Everything appeared legitimate. "We live in a quiet cabin because Emma gets overwhelmed by crowds and noise," Victor explained. "The doctors recommended a peaceful environment for her recovery. But lately she's been having flashbacks about her life before the accident. Sometimes she believes her parents are still alive and that I took her away from them." Detective Morrison studied the documents carefully. They looked official, but something nagged at her. "Mr. Hendricks, why wasn't Emma reported missing when she disappeared?" I was afraid to call the police. Emma's social worker warned me that if she had another episode, if she ran away again, the state might decide I'm not capable of caring for her. They might put her in foster care." Victor's voice broke. "She's all the family I have left. I thought I could find her myself." Through the room's window, Emma could see Victor talking with the detective. "He looks older," she observed, "and sadder. I think I really scared him." Dr. Rachel sat beside Emma. "Honey, Uncle Victor says you have something called PTSD. Do you know what that means?" Emma nodded slowly. "It means my brain gets confused sometimes about what's real and what's a scary memory. Uncle Victor has been helping me get better, but sometimes I forget which thoughts are true and which ones are from the bad dreams." Olivia entered the room with a concerned expression. "Emma, before we let Uncle Victor take you home, we need to make absolutely sure you're safe with him. Is there anything at all, that Uncle Victor has done that made you feel uncomfortable or afraid?" Emma thought carefully. "Uncle Victor never hurt me. He taught me to read and write, and he makes the best pancakes in the world. He sings me to sleep when I have nightmares." She paused. "But sometimes I get confused and think he's hiding something from me. That's when I get scared and want to run away." Just then, Uncle Victor appeared in the doorway, his eyes filled with tears of relief and something else, something that looked almost like guilt. Uncle Victor stood in the doorway, and for a moment, time seemed frozen. Emma looked at him with a mixture of love and confusion that broke everyone's heart. "Uncle Victor," she whispered, but she didn't run to him like a typical child would run to a beloved guardian. Victor stepped slowly into the room, his hands shaking slightly. "Hello, little bird," he said softly, using his pet name for her. "I was so worried about you." Detective Morrison watched carefully as Victor approached Emma's bed. His body language showed genuine care and concern, but Emma's reaction was puzzling. She seemed happy to see him, but also uncertain. "I'm sorry I ran away," Emma said quietly. "I got confused again, didn't I?" "It's not your fault, sweetheart," Victor replied, sitting in the chair beside her bed. "Sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we've been through difficult things." Dr. Rachel stepped forward. Mr. Hendricks, we need to discuss Emma's medical care. She was severely dehydrated and malnourished when she was found. Victor's face flushed with shame. Emma has been refusing to eat properly for the past week. Ever since she started having those flashbacks about her parents, she convinced herself that I was keeping her from them, that they were still alive and looking for her. He turned to Emma with infinite gentleness. Do you remember what we talked about, little bird? About how your mama and papa are in heaven now, and I'm taking care of you because that's what they would have wanted? Emma nodded, but her expression remained uncertain. But the dreams feel so real, Uncle Victor. In the dreams, they're not in heaven. They're in a big house and they're angry and they're looking for me. Dreams can feel very real when we're scared, Victor said patiently. But I promise you, Emma, your parents loved you very much. They're at peace now. Detective Morrison studied the interaction carefully. Victor's documents appeared legitimate and his care for Emma seemed genuine, but something about the situation still bothered her. Mr. Hendricks, I need to ask you about your living situation. Emma says you live in an isolated cabin. Is she receiving proper schooling? I homeschool her, Victor replied. Emma is actually quite advanced for her age. She reads at a 5th grade level. But traditional school settings overwhelm her. Too many people, too much noise. It triggers her anxiety. Olivia opened her laptop. I'd like to verify Emma's educational records and medical history. Can you provide me with the names of her doctors and therapists? For the first time, Victor hesitated. We've been managing her care privately. Emma has trust issues with new people. She does better with consistent familiar caregivers. But surely there must be some official records, Detective Morrison pressed. Child services would need to monitor her progress. Victor's eyes darted nervously around the room. Emma's case was unusual. Because of the specific nature of her trauma, we were granted permission for private care. I have all the paperwork at home. Emma watched this exchange with growing anxiety. Are you going to take me away from Uncle Victor? She asked Detective Morrison. He's the only family I have now. Before Morrison could answer, Victor spoke up. Emma, why don't you tell these nice people about our home, about the garden we planted together and the books we read? Emma's face brightened slightly. We have a beautiful garden with tomatoes and carrots, and Uncle Victor built me a swing between 2 big oak trees. We read stories every night by the fireplace. But then her expression clouded. Though sometimes I wonder why we never see other people. Uncle Victor says it's because people wouldn't understand about my special situation. Dr. Rachel noticed something important. Emma, when you have your flashbacks about the big house and angry people, do you remember any specific details? Names, faces, places? Emma closed her eyes, concentrating. The lady had sparkly rings and always smelled like flowers. She would cry and say things like, "This isn't the life I wanted," and the man would shout about money and business deals. She opened her eyes suddenly. But Uncle Victor says those are just confused memories mixed up with bad dreams. Victor quickly interjected. The trauma specialists explained that Emma's mind created false memories to cope with the real tragedy. Sometimes children imagine elaborate scenarios to avoid accepting painful truths. But as Victor spoke these words, Emma looked at him with an expression that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. It was the look of a child who desperately wanted to believe what she was being told, but somehow couldn't quite convince herself it was true. Detective Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Mr. Hendricks, I'm going to need you to come to the station tomorrow with all of Emma's official paperwork. Until then, Emma will remain here under protective custody. That night, the hospital felt different. Emma couldn't sleep, and neither could the adults who were trying to solve the puzzle of her life. In the nurse's break room, an unexpected conversation was taking place. Sarah Martinez, a veteran nurse who'd worked at Pinewood General for 30 years, was studying a photo of Emma with a puzzled expression. "Dr. Rachel, can I speak with you privately?" Sarah asked, her voice unusually serious. They stepped into a quiet corner of the hallway. "That little girl," Sarah said, pointing toward Emma's room. "Something about her has been bothering me for days. She reminds me of someone." "What do you mean?" Sarah pulled out her phone and scrolled through old news articles. About 6 years ago, there was a big story in the county newspaper. A wealthy family, the Carmichaels, lost their daughter in a boating accident at Silver Lake. The child's body was never found. Dr. Rachel felt her heart skip a beat. Go on. I remember the case because it was so tragic. The little girl was named Grace Carmichael, and she would have been about Emma's age now. Sarah showed Rachel a newspaper photo. Look at this picture, Rachel. Look at those eyes. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same deep brown eyes, the same delicate facial features, even the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking. But that's impossible, Rachel whispered. Emma's uncle has legal documents proving he's her guardian after her parents died in a car accident. Documents can be forged, Sarah said quietly. And I remember something else about the Carmichael case. They had a gardener who worked on their estate, a quiet man who was especially fond of little Grace. After the accident, he quit suddenly and disappeared. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. What was the gardener's name? I can't remember exactly, but I think it started with a V. Victor, maybe? Meanwhile, in Emma's room, the little girl was having another one of her vivid dreams. She tossed and turned, whispering fragments that made the night nurse lean in to listen. The water was so cold, Emma mumbled in her sleep. Uncle Victor pulled me out, said we had to go away. Couldn't go back to the loud house. When Emma woke up, she found Dr. Rachel sitting beside her bed with a gentle expression. Hi, sweetheart. You were talking in your sleep. Do you remember what you were dreaming about? Emma rubbed her eyes. The water dream again. I always have that one. She sat up, looking more alert. Dr. Rachel, can I ask you something? Of course. Why do grown-ups sometimes tell children that things are true when they're not sure themselves? Emma's question was so mature, so perceptive, that Rachel was taken aback. What makes you ask that, honey? Uncle Victor always says my mama and papa are in heaven. But when he says it, his eyes look the same way yours do right now, like he's hoping I'll believe something that he's not completely sure about. Rachel chose her words carefully. Sometimes adults think they're protecting children by not telling them things that might be confusing or scary. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I think Uncle Victor is protecting me from something, but I think maybe he's also protecting himself. She paused. Is that possible? Can someone be protecting and hiding at the same time? Before Rachel could answer, Emma continued. In my water dream, I'm not drowning. Uncle Victor is saving me. But everyone around the water is crying and screaming like something terrible happened. She looked directly at Rachel. Do you think it's possible to be saved from one scary thing but then have to live with a different kind of scary thing? Rachel realized she was talking to a remarkably insightful child who was piecing together her own truth despite the confusion surrounding her. Emma, if you could ask Uncle Victor one question, just one question, and you knew he would tell you the absolute truth, what would you ask him? Emma didn't hesitate. I would ask him to tell me my real name, because sometimes when I look in the mirror, I don't feel like an Emma. I feel like someone else wearing Emma's life. Just then, Sarah appeared in the doorway with a newspaper clipping in her hand, and an expression that suggested Emma's instincts about her identity were about to be proven right. Sarah entered Emma's room with trembling hands, carrying a newspaper clipping that was 6 years old. Dr. Rachel saw the gravity in the veteran nurse's expression and immediately knew this moment would change everything. Emma, honey, Sarah said gently, sitting down across from the little girl. I want to show you something, but I need you to be very brave, okay? Emma nodded, sensing the importance of the moment. Sarah unfolded the newspaper clipping carefully. The headline read, Local family devastated by tragic boating accident. 4-year-old daughter missing, presumed drowned. Below the headline was a photograph of a beautiful little girl with the exact same features as Emma. Emma stared at the photo for a long moment, her finger tracing the image. She looks just like me, she whispered. But that's not possible, is it? The little girl in this picture was named Grace Carmichael, Sarah explained softly. She disappeared 6 years ago during a boating accident at Silver Lake. Her body was never found. Emma's eyes widened. Grace, she repeated slowly. Grace. Something flickered in her expression, a spark of recognition. Sometimes in my dreams, people call me Grace. I always thought it was just a made-up dream name. Doctor? Rachel sat on the edge of the bed. Emma, or Grace, what else do you remember about these dreams? There's a big white house with tall windows and a circular driveway, Emma said, her voice becoming stronger as memories surfaced. And there's a rose garden where I like to hide when the grown-ups were arguing. The roses smelled so sweet, but the voices from the house were always angry. She paused, concentrating harder. There was a nice man who worked in the garden. He had gray hair and kind eyes, and he would let me help him plant flowers. When the people in the house would yell, he would tell me stories about brave little girls who went on adventures. Sarah and Rachel exchanged meaningful glances. The description matched what they knew about the Carmichael estate and their former gardener. Emma, Rachel said carefully, the nice man in the garden. Do you remember his name? Victor, Emma said without hesitation. His name was Victor, and he said I was his favorite little helper. Her expression grew puzzled. But wait, if I'm Grace from the newspaper, then what happened to me? The article says I drowned. Sarah chose her words carefully. Sometimes when terrible things happen, people make difficult choices thinking they're doing the right thing. Emma's young mind was working rapidly. You mean, Uncle Victor saved me from drowning, but then everyone thought I was dead? The implications began to dawn on her. So my real mama and papa think I died? We don't know for sure yet, sweetheart, Rachel said, but we're going to find out the truth. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing this life-changing information. When she spoke again, her voice was small but determined. I remember now. My real name is Grace Carmichael, and the people in the big house, Margaret and Charles, they were my mama and papa. She looked up at Sarah with tears in her eyes. But they didn't love me the way Uncle Victor does. They were always angry at each other, and they forgot about me a lot. Uncle Victor was the only one who made me feel special. Grace, Rachel said gently, even if your parents had problems, they lost their little girl. They've been grieving for you for 6 years. But what if they didn't want me back then? Grace asked, her voice full of confusion. What if Uncle Victor saved me from people who couldn't take care of me properly? It was an impossible question that highlighted the complex reality of Grace's situation. Victor had essentially kidnapped her, but possibly from a genuinely neglectful situation. He'd loved and cared for her for 6 years, but had also stolen her identity and made her family believe she was dead. Grace, Sarah said, there's something else you should know. Your parents, Margaret and Charles Carmichael, they never gave up looking for you. Even after all these years, they still hold a memorial service for you every year on the anniversary of the accident. Grace's eyes filled with tears. They still remember me? They never stopped loving you, honey, even when they thought you were gone forever. Grace sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes before asking the question that would determine her future. If Uncle Victor saved me because he loved me, but my real parents have been sad because they love me too, how do we fix something like that? Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Detective Morrison's voice could be heard saying urgently, "We need to find Victor Hendricks immediately. He's no longer at his last known address, and his cabin has been completely abandoned." The news hit everyone like a thunderbolt. Victor Hendricks had vanished during the night, leaving behind no trace except an empty cabin and a letter addressed simply to Grace. Detective Morrison entered the room with the letter in her hands, her expression grim. Grace, Victor left this for you. Before you read it, I want you to know that we're going to find him and get answers to all your questions. Grace took the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was familiar, the same careful script that had written her bedtime stories for 6 years. My dearest little bird, by the time you read this, you will know the truth about who you really are. I have been carrying this secret for so long, and I know now that keeping it was wrong, even though I did it out of love. I want you to know that when I found you that day by the lake, you were not drowning. You had fallen from the dock and were scared and crying. Your parents were inside the house, arguing so loudly they couldn't hear you calling for help. I pulled you out of the water and was going to take you inside, But then I heard your father shouting terrible things and your mother crying. In that moment, I made a choice that I've questioned every day since. I saw a little girl who needed love and peace, and I thought I could give you a better life than the chaos you were living in. I was wrong to take you away from your family, but I was not wrong to love you. You have been the light of my life for 6 years, Grace. Every day with you has been a gift, but now you know the truth, and you deserve to choose your own path. I have loved you as if you were my own daughter, and that love will never change, no matter what happens to me. Be brave, little bird. Fly where your heart tells you to go. Your Uncle Victor. Grace finished reading the letter with tears streaming down her face. The adults in the room watched anxiously as she processed this final revelation. He really did love me, she whispered, but he also knew what he did was wrong. Dr. Rachel sat beside her. How do you feel about all of this, Grace? Grace wiped her eyes, showing maturity beyond her years. I feel sad and confused and scared, but also relieved. I always knew something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Uncle Victor tried so hard to make me happy, but I could feel his sadness. Now I understand why. Detective Morrison leaned forward. Grace, we've contacted your biological parents. Margaret and Charles Carmichael want to see you, but only if you're ready. You don't have to make any decisions right now. Are they still angry people? Grace asked. Are they still the same as they were when I was little? People can change, honey, Detective Morrison said. Losing you changed them in ways you might not expect. But you'll be able to see for yourself, and you'll have counselors and social workers to help you through this. Grace nodded thoughtfully. I want to see them, but I also want to find Uncle Victor. He shouldn't be alone right now. He must be very scared, too. Olivia had been quiet during this conversation, but now she spoke up. Grace, what you're showing right now, thinking about everyone's feelings, wanting to help even the person who made a very big mistake, that shows how well Uncle Victor raised you. He may have made the wrong choice 6 years ago, but he raised you to be a caring, thoughtful person. Will Uncle Victor get in trouble? Grace asked, her voice small. Yes, Detective Morrison said honestly. What he did was against the law, but the fact that he loved you and cared for you will be taken into consideration. Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her words surprised everyone. I think Uncle Victor saved me from one kind of sadness, but accidentally gave me a different kind of sadness. Maybe now we can all figure out how to fix both kinds. That night, as Grace finally fell asleep, she whispered something that made Dr. Rachel's heart ache. I hope my real mama and papa still like bedtime stories. Uncle Victor taught me how to tell really good ones. Outside the hospital, unbeknownst to anyone inside, a figure sat in an old pickup truck in the parking lot. Victor Hendricks had returned, knowing he couldn't run from the truth any longer, but terrified of losing the only family he'd ever truly loved. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Pinewood General Hospital. Officer Matthew Clark stood at the information desk, still officially banned from Emma's case, but unable to stay away. I'm here to check on the little girl, he told the receptionist. Emma, or Grace, I should say. Dr. Rachel spotted him from the hallway and approached with a knowing smile. I thought you might show up eventually. Captain Harris isn't going to be happy. Some things are more important than following orders, Matthew replied. How is she handling everything? Better than most adults would, honestly. She's remarkable. Rachel paused. Matthew, there's something you should know. Victor Hendricks was spotted in the hospital parking lot last night. Security footage shows his truck, but he never came inside. Matthew felt a familiar protective instinct surge through him. Is Grace safe? We believe so. But I think Victor is struggling with whether to turn himself in or run. And frankly, Grace is worried about him. In her room, Grace was sitting by the window, watching the parking lot intently. When she saw Matthew approaching her door, her face lit up with genuine joy for the first time in days. Officer Matthew, she called out, practically bouncing in her hospital bed. You came back. I promised I wouldn't leave you, Matthew said, sitting in his familiar chair beside her bed. I hear you've learned some very important things about yourself. Grace nodded solemnly. My real name is Grace Carmichael, and Uncle Victor saved me from a lake but also kind of stole me from my real family. She paused, studying Matthew's face. Are you disappointed in him? Matthew considered his words carefully. I think Uncle Victor loved you so much that he made a very big mistake trying to protect you. Sometimes when adults are scared, they don't make the best choices. That's what I think too, Grace said. And now he's scared again, isn't he? That's why he's hiding in the parking lot. Matthew's eyebrows raised. You know he's out there? I can feel it. Uncle Victor taught me to pay attention to my feelings, and my feelings tell me he's close but afraid to come see me. Grace looked directly at Matthew. Will you help me talk to him? I think he needs to know that I still love him, even though what he did was wrong. Before Matthew could answer, Detective Morrison entered the room with news. Grace, your biological parents are here. Margaret and Charles Carmichael would like to meet you, but only when you're ready. Grace took a deep breath. I'm ready. But first, can Officer Matthew help me with something important? An hour later, Matthew found himself walking slowly through the hospital parking lot, with Grace holding his hand and Detective Morrison following at a distance. Grace had insisted that they needed to find Uncle Victor before meeting her biological parents. There, Grace pointed to an old pickup truck parked behind a maintenance building. That's Uncle Victor's truck. As they approached, they could see Victor sitting in the driver's seat, his head in his hands. When he looked up and saw Grace walking toward him, his face crumpled with emotion. Victor slowly got out of the truck, his hands shaking. Hello, little bird, he said softly. Grace let go of Matthew's hand and ran to Victor, wrapping her arms around his waist. Uncle Victor, you don't have to hide anymore. We're going to figure this out together. Grace, I'm so sorry, Victor whispered, tears streaming down his face. I thought I was protecting you, but I know now that I hurt a lot of people, including you. You did protect me, Grace said firmly. You taught me how to read and write, how to garden, how to be brave. You loved me when I needed love. That wasn't wrong. Victor knelt down to Grace's level. But I also kept you from your real family, little bird. That was very wrong. Grace nodded seriously. Yes, it was. But Uncle Victor, sometimes people do wrong things for right reasons. Now, we have to do right things to fix the wrong things. Standing there in the parking lot, watching this remarkable little girl comfort the man who had both saved and stolen her life, Matthew realized that Grace was about to teach all the adults around her what true forgiveness really meant. The hospital conference room had been transformed into a neutral meeting space, where one of the most emotionally charged reunions in Pinewood County's history was about to take place. Margaret and Charles Carmichael sat on one side of the room, their faces showing 6 years of grief, hope, and nervous anticipation. Across from them, Grace sat between Officer Matthew and Dr. Rachel, with Detective Morrison and Olivia nearby for support. Grace studied her biological parents carefully. Margaret was an elegant woman in her early 40s, with the same brown eyes as Grace, but they were eyes that had known deep sorrow. Charles was a tall, distinguished man who kept wiping his hands nervously on his pants. Hello, Grace, Margaret said softly, her voice trembling. You're so beautiful, so grown up. Hello, Grace replied politely. You look different than I remembered. Sadder, but also kinder somehow. Charles leaned forward slightly. Grace, we want you to know that we never stopped looking for you, never stopped hoping. When the police called yesterday, his voice broke. We thought it was a miracle. Grace tilted her head, studying them with the same analytical look she'd inherited from both parents. Uncle Victor said you used to fight a lot. Do you still fight? Margaret and Charles exchanged a glance filled with 6 years of shared grief and healing. No, sweetheart, Margaret said. Losing you changed us. We realized that our anger with each other was hurting the most important thing in our lives, our family. We went to counseling, Charles added. We learned how to talk to each other instead of shouting. We learned that our love for you was stronger than any problem we thought we had. Grace nodded thoughtfully. Uncle Victor said that sometimes people need to lose something precious to understand how precious it really was. He was right about that, Margaret whispered, tears starting to fall. Grace, can you ever forgive us for not being the parents you deserved when you were little? Grace considered this question seriously. Uncle Victor taught me that forgiveness isn't something you give just once. It's something you choose to give every day, even when it's hard. She paused. I forgive you for the past, but I need to know about the future. What do you mean? Charles asked. If I came home with you, would it be to the same big house where everyone was always angry? Or would it be to a new kind of home where people talk about their feelings instead of yelling about them? Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out several photographs. We moved out of the big house 2 years after you disappeared. We couldn't bear to live there anymore. Now we have a smaller, cozy home with a garden. Would you like to see pictures? Grace looked at the photos of a charming house with flower boxes and a tire swing in the backyard. It looks peaceful, she said, but Uncle Victor taught me that what makes a house feel like home isn't what it looks like. It's how people treat each other inside it. You're absolutely right, Charles said. Grace, we can't promise we'll be perfect parents, but we can promise that we'll never stop trying to be better. We've learned that love means listening, not just talking. Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her words surprised everyone. I want to come home with you, but I also want Uncle Victor to be part of my life somehow. He made a big mistake, but he's still my family too. Margaret and Charles looked at each other, then back at Grace. That's a very complicated situation, honey, Charles said carefully. I know, Grace replied, but Uncle Victor taught me that complicated doesn't mean impossible. It just means we have to be extra patient and extra kind while we figure it out. Dr. Rachel spoke up. There will be a legal process to determine what's best for everyone involved. But Grace, the fact that you want to find a way to love everyone in your life shows incredible wisdom. Grace looked around the room at all the adults who were trying to do right by her. Can I ask you all something? Instead of deciding what's best for me, can we all work together to figure out what's best for everyone? Because I think Uncle Victor needs a family too. The room fell silent as everyone realized that this 7-year-old child was about to teach them something profound about the true meaning of family, forgiveness, and love. 2 weeks later, the Pinewood County Courthouse held its breath as Judge Patricia Reynolds prepared to make a decision that would change everyone's life forever. Grace sat between her court advocate and Dr. Rachel, wearing a new dress from Margaret, but clutching the wooden bird Victor had carved years ago. Victor stood before the judge, having voluntarily surrendered after Grace's reunion with her biological parents. Mr. Hendricks, Judge Reynolds began, you've pleaded guilty to kidnapping, yet multiple witnesses testify you provided excellent care for Grace. This is unprecedented. Victor's voice shook as he addressed the Carmichaels directly. I owe you an apology beyond words. I believed I was saving Grace from an unhappy situation, but I robbed you of 6 years and the chance to heal as a family. Margaret wiped tears away. What you did was wrong, but the daughter who returned to us is kind, intelligent, and loving. She learned those qualities from someone who clearly cherished her. Charles nodded. We've lost 6 precious years, but we see that you raised her with genuine love. Judge Reynolds turned to Grace. This court needs your thoughts about your future, Grace. Grace stood, still holding her wooden bird. Your Honor, I've learned that love isn't limited to one person or family. My heart is big enough to love my mama and Papa Carmichael, and also love Uncle Victor. The courtroom fell silent as she continued. Uncle Victor made a mistake, but he also saved me. He taught me that family isn't just who you're born to. It's who chooses to love you every single day. I want to live with my real parents because they're my family and they've missed me. But I also want Uncle Victor to have a chance to be part of my life somehow. Margaret stood unexpectedly. Your Honor, we've discussed this extensively. While we cannot condone Mr. Hendricks's actions, Grace loves him. We would consider supervised visitation as part of any sentencing, provided he completes counseling and community service. Grace smiled radiantly. That means we can all be a family together, just differently than before. Judge Reynolds realized she was about to redefine how justice and healing could work together. 6 months later, The unconventional solution that Judge Reynolds had crafted was working better than anyone had dared to dream. Victor Hendricks had been sentenced to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service working with troubled youth, and mandatory counseling sessions. As part of his rehabilitation, he was allowed supervised visits with Grace twice a month, always in the presence of a social worker and with the full support of Grace's biological parents. On this particular Saturday morning in late spring, Grace was practically vibrating with excitement as she waited in the garden behind her family's cozy new home. Today was one of Victor's visit days, and she had been planning a very special surprise for weeks. "Mama, do you think Uncle Victor will like what we planted together?" Grace asked Margaret, who was carefully tending to a beautiful rose bush nearby, the same variety that had grown in the garden where Grace used to hide as a small child. "I think he'll absolutely love it, sweetheart," Margaret replied, still amazed at how naturally Grace had adapted to calling her Mama while maintaining her deep affection for Victor. The transition hadn't always been smooth. There had been tears, confusion, and difficult conversations, but with patience and family counseling, they'd found their rhythm. "You've worked so incredibly hard on this project." Charles emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of fresh lemonade and wearing the relaxed smile that had become his signature since Grace's return. "The social worker just called," he announced. "They're about 5 minutes away." Grace had spent the past 6 months learning to balance her love for Victor with her growing, deepening relationship with her biological parents. It hadn't always been easy. There were moments of confusion when she missed the simplicity of her cabin life, tears when she felt pulled between two worlds, and difficult conversations about forgiveness and consequences. But with the help of weekly family counseling sessions, all the adults in Grace's life had learned to work together for her emotional well-being. When Victor arrived with Olivia, the social worker who had become like family to all of them, Grace ran to greet him with her usual unbridled enthusiasm. The monthly visits had become precious to everyone involved. "Uncle Victor, I have something absolutely amazing to show you," Grace called out, practically bouncing on her toes. Victor's weathered face lit up with the pure joy that always appeared when he saw Grace. The supervised visits had become a cornerstone of his healing process, a reminder of the genuine love they shared while also helping him understand and respect the boundaries he needed to maintain for Grace's sake and his own growth. "What's this wonderful surprise, little bird?" he asked, following Grace toward the garden with the eager anticipation of someone who had learned to treasure every moment. Grace led him to a section of the yard where she had spent weeks creating a beautiful vegetable garden, with Margaret and Charles's enthusiastic help. "Look, I planted tomatoes and carrots and lettuce just like we used to grow together at our cabin. And Mama and Papa helped me build the most amazing scarecrow. But the real surprise, the one that made Victor's eyes immediately fill with tears of joy and healing, was what Grace had planted in the very center of the garden. A small oak sapling surrounded by colorful wildflowers, with a hand-painted sign that read, 'The Forgiveness Tree, growing stronger every day.'" "Grace," Victor whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he knelt down beside the little tree. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Dr. Rachel told me that oak trees grow very slowly, but they live for hundreds and hundreds of years," Grace explained, with the earnestness that had become her trademark. "I thought it was absolutely perfect because forgiveness grows slowly too, but when it really takes root deep in the ground, it lasts forever and ever." As Victor gently touched the young oak's leaves, he realized that Grace had given him something more precious than forgiveness. She had given him hope for a future where love could heal even the deepest wounds. 1 year later, Pinewood County was celebrating its annual Community Heroes Day, and this year's ceremony would be remembered as the most extraordinary in the town's long history. Grace Carmichael, now 8 years old and radiating confidence and joy, stood on the decorated platform in the town square, wearing her favorite blue dress and holding a speech she had written entirely by herself over many careful weeks. Around her, hundreds of community members had gathered to hear the conclusion of a story that had touched every heart in the county. Officer Matthew Clark stood proudly in the front row, wearing his crisp dress uniform and beaming with the kind of pride reserved for watching someone you love achieve something remarkable. Beside him stood Dr. Rachel Morgan and Olivia Brooks, the three adults who had first fought tirelessly to protect Grace during that confusing, frightening time when she was just a lost little girl who trusted only Matthew. Margaret and Charles Carmichael sat in the second row, holding hands tightly and watching their daughter with amazement and overwhelming love. Next to them, in a place of honor that had required months of delicate legal paperwork and community discussion to arrange, sat Victor Hendricks, wearing his best suit and carrying the quiet dignity of someone who had faced his mistakes and worked hard to make amends. "Thank you all for coming here today," Grace began, her clear, strong voice carrying across the square with remarkable poise. "I want to tell you about the most important thing I've learned this past year, that real heroes don't always look like what you expect them to look like." She looked out at the crowd, making deliberate eye contact with each of the important adults who had shaped her incredible journey. "Exactly 1 year ago, I was a little girl who was lost in more ways than one. I thought I knew who I was and where I belonged, but I didn't really understand what family truly meant, or how love could exist in so many different forms." Grace's speech continued with the wisdom and emotional intelligence of someone far beyond her years, captivating everyone present. "I learned that Officer Matthew is a hero because he chose to care about one scared, confused little girl, instead of just following the rules that said he should step away. Dr. Rachel is a hero because she listened not just to my words, but to my heart, when I couldn't find the right words to explain my feelings. Miss Olivia is a hero because she fought every single day to keep me safe, while all the grown-ups figured out what would be best for me." The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word as Grace continued her remarkable speech. "My mama and Papa Carmichael are heroes because they chose forgiveness instead of staying angry, and because they loved me enough to let me love other people too, even when that was complicated and sometimes painful." Grace's voice grew softer but more powerful. "And Uncle Victor is a hero because he spent 6 years putting my happiness and safety before his own needs, and because when he finally realized he had made a serious mistake, he was brave enough to face the consequences and work to make things right." Grace paused, looking directly at Victor with eyes full of love and understanding. "Uncle Victor taught me that being a real hero doesn't mean you never make mistakes. It means that when you do make mistakes, you take full responsibility for them, and you work as hard as you can to make things better for everyone involved." In the audience, Victor wiped tears from his eyes, overwhelmed by Grace's words and by the journey they had all traveled together. The past year of community service had shown him that he could channel his protective instincts in positive, healthy ways, helping other children and families navigate their own difficult situations. "Today, I want to give a very special award to my entire family," Grace continued, reaching into her pocket, "because they taught me that family isn't just about who you live with or who you were born to. Family is about who chooses to love you unconditionally, who helps you grow into your best self, and who stands by you even when things get really, really complicated." Grace pulled out 6 small wooden birds that Victor had spent weeks carving, one for each of the adults who had shaped her journey toward healing and wholeness. "These are for all of my heroes. Uncle Victor taught me that little birds need to learn how to fly on their own, but they also need to know they always have a safe, loving place to land when they need rest." As Grace presented each wooden bird, the recipients stood together across the platform, 6 people who had started as strangers, but had become a unique, beautiful, blended family, united by their unwavering love for one extraordinary little girl who had taught them all what forgiveness, courage, and unconditional love really meant.